Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in again. Tonight, I'm sharing a story that landed in my inbox recently, an email from a viewer who wanted their chilling experience told. As I read it, I couldn't help but feel the weight of their words. This wasn't just a story, it felt personal. And as I recount it for you, I'll let you slip into their shoes, feeling every breath, every whisper, and every cold touch of fear. Let's begin. It started on a December night, one of those bone-chilling evenings when the wind whistles through the cracks in the walls, making the house creak like a ship at sea. I had been working late, a deadline loomed, and the hours stretched into the darkest part of the night. The world outside was blanketed in snow, silent, save for the occasional groan of the trees bending under its weight. I lived alone at the time, in a modest two-story house tucked away at the edge of a small town. Winter nights in the countryside are deafeningly quiet, and this night was no different. The only sounds came from my fingers tapping the keyboard and the faint hum of the radiator struggling to keep the house warm. It was around 1:00 a.m. when I first noticed it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, like a soft scratching. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The noise seemed to come from upstairs, in the attic. My initial thought was that it was just the wind, or perhaps a mouse scurrying around. Old houses like mine have their quirks, and I'd learned to ignore most of them. But then it happened again, louder this time, a deliberate dragging scratch, as if something or someone was clawing at the wooden floor above me. My heart began to race, the sound amplifying the stillness of the house. I told myself it was nothing, but the unease was like a shadow creeping over me. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. I grabbed the flashlight I kept in the kitchen drawer and made my way upstairs. The staircase groaned under my weight, each step sounding like a warning. As I reached the attic door, I hesitated. The scratching had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my ears. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of blackness peeking through. I could feel the cold air seeping out, colder than the rest of the house, like the attic held its own winter. I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in protest. The beam of my flashlight swept across the room, revealing dusty boxes, an old rocking chair, and forgotten furniture. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet the air felt heavy, as if the room itself was watching me. Then I saw it. At the far corner of the attic, partially obscured by shadows, was a mirror I didn't recognize. It was tall, its ornate frame tarnished with age, and its surface was clouded, as though it hadn't been cleaned in decades. My reflection stared back at me, but something about it felt wrong. I stepped closer, the flashlight trembling in my hand. As I neared the mirror, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My reflection wasn't mimicking my movements. When I raised my hand, it stayed still. When I tilted my head, it stared straight ahead. And then, it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a grin that stretched too wide, showing teeth that were unnaturally sharp. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, knocking over a box. The sound seemed to snap me out of my paralysis, and I bolted down the stairs, slamming the attic door shut behind me. Back in my room, I locked the door and sat on the bed, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I told myself it was a trick of the light, my tired mind playing games with me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against the wall, the flashlight clutched tightly in my hands. And all the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The morning came sluggishly, the pale sunlight filtering through the curtains, doing little to dispel the chill that had settled deep into my bones. I stayed in bed longer than usual, replaying the events of the night over and over in my mind. It had to be a trick of the light, I thought again. Or maybe I was just overworked. Still, I couldn't bring myself to go back into the attic. I avoided looking at the ceiling, fearing I might hear that scratching again, or worse, see something move. By mid-afternoon, I convinced myself that leaving the house would help. Maybe some fresh air would clear my head. So I bundled up, grabbed my keys, and stepped out into the snow-covered world. The town was quiet, the streets lined with icicles and frost-covered cars. I decided to visit a local cafe, a small, cozy place with a crackling fireplace and the comforting smell of coffee and cinnamon. It was my usual spot for unwinding, but even there, the unease followed me. I was halfway through my coffee when I overheard two elderly women at the next table. Their conversation was quiet, but a particular phrase caught my attention. The cursed mirror. My ears perked up and I leaned closer, pretending to read a magazine. I'm telling you, one of them whispered, there's something about those old things. They hold on to energy, bad energy. Didn't someone say they found one in that old house on Birch Lane? The other replied, her voice low but urgent. My stomach dropped. Birch Lane, that was my street. They continued talking, recounting stories about objects carrying spirits, cursed antiques, and how such items often end up in estate sales or forgotten corners of attics. I left the cafe feeling more unsettled than before. The mirror in my attic hadn't been there when I moved in, I was sure of it, but how had it gotten there? That evening, as darkness swallowed the town again, I found myself staring at the attic door from the safety of the living room. The mirror felt like a weight pressing on the house, its presence undeniable even though I couldn't see it. I needed answers. Summoning what little courage I had, I pulled out my laptop and started researching antique mirrors, hauntings, and cursed objects. Most of what I found seemed like folklore stories meant to scare people or sell ghost hunting books, but then I stumbled across a forum dedicated to paranormal experiences. One thread caught my eye. When mirrors reflect something they shouldn't. The posts were chilling. People shared tales of seeing reflections that didn't match reality, mirrors that moved on their own, or ones that seemed to show a different time or place. But one comment stood out. If you find a mirror in your house that doesn't belong, don't touch it. Mirrors are portals. They can trap things or let them out. I slammed the laptop shut, my pulse racing. I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, that the mirror was nothing more than an old piece of furniture. But the memories of that twisted smile and the way my reflection refused to mimic me were too vivid to ignore. Around midnight, the scratching started again. It was louder this time, more insistent, like nails raking across the floorboards. I sat frozen on the couch, every instinct screaming at me to leave the house, but I couldn't move. Then the sound stopped. For a moment, the silence was even worse. It stretched on, heavy and oppressive, until a new sound emerged, a faint, rhythmic creaking. The rocking chair. My heart was a drumbeat in my ears as I forced myself to listen. The chair in the attic was moving, slowly back and forth, the creaks echoing through the house like a grotesque lullaby. I grabbed my phone and called my friend Julie. She was the practical one, the kind of person who'd roll her eyes at ghost stories and tell me to get a grip. But tonight, her voice was tinged with concern. "Why are you still in the house?" she asked. "If it's freaking you out this much, just leave." "I can't," I whispered, glancing at the attic door. "I don't know why, but I feel like if I leave, it'll follow me." There was a long pause on the other end. Finally, Julie said, "I'll come over." Julie arrived 20 minutes later, armed with a flashlight, sage, and a baseball bat. She made fun of me at first, calling me dramatic, but when she stepped inside the house, her expression changed. "It's freezing in here," she said, rubbing her arms. I nodded. The attic. We climbed the stairs together, Julie leading the way with the bat in one hand and the flashlight in the other. When we reached the attic door, the creaking stopped. She pushed the door open, and we both gasped. The mirror was no longer in the corner. It was in the center of the room, tilted slightly as if it were staring at us. The rocking chair sat empty beside it, perfectly still. Julie whispered, "What the hell?" Julie stepped cautiously into the attic, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the gloom. I stayed by the doorway, my feet glued to the floor as my pulse thundered in my ears. "This thing looks ancient," she muttered, inching closer to the mirror. The ornate frame seemed darker than I remembered. Its once tarnished silver, now blackened as though charred by invisible flames. "Don't touch it," I warned, my voice barely above a whisper. Julie crouched, inspecting the mirror from a safe distance. "There's something carved into the frame," she said. "Symbols or writing." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I hadn't noticed any markings before, but now that she pointed them out, the symbols seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. "Julie, let's just go," I urged, taking a step back. But before she could respond, the flashlight flickered. For a brief moment, the attic was plunged into darkness. When the light steadied again, the mirror's surface rippled, like water disturbed by a pebble. Julie stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Did you see that?" I nodded, unable to speak. The mirror was no longer reflecting the attic. Instead, it showed a scene drenched in shadows. The room on the other side was similar to my attic, but warped. Its walls seemed to bleed darkness, and the rocking chair was occupied. There was someone or something sitting in it. At first, it looked like a shadow, its form indistinct. But as we stared, it began to solidify. Long skeletal fingers gripped the arms of the chair, and a face emerged, a grotesque parody of humanity, with hollow eyes and a smile that stretched unnaturally wide. It was grinning at us. "Julie," I whispered, "we need to get out of here." She nodded, her face pale, but just as we turned to leave, the attic door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Julie yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," she cried, panic creeping into her voice. Behind us, the mirror's surface began to glow faintly, casting the room in an eerie light. The figure in the rocking chair stood slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it wasn't used to its body. I grabbed Julie's arm, pulling her back from the mirror. "Stay away from it." The figure stepped closer, its hollow eyes fixed on us. With every step, the air grew colder, and the symbols on the mirror's frame glowed brighter. Julie screamed as the figure reached the edge of the glass and pressed its skeletal hand against the surface. The mirror cracked, a web of fractures spreading across it like frost. "Help me," Julie shouted, pulling desperately at the door. I joined her, throwing my weight against it, but it was no use. The mirror groaned, the cracks deepening as the figure pushed harder, as though trying to break through. Then, as if in answer to our silent prayers, the attic light flickered on. The sudden brightness was blinding, and the mirror let out a high-pitched screech. The figure recoiled, its form dissolving into wisps of shadow before disappearing entirely. The attic door flew open, and we tumbled out, slamming it shut behind us. Downstairs, we sat in silence, the only sound our ragged breathing. Julie clutched the baseball bat like a lifeline, her hands trembling. "What the hell was that?" she finally asked, her voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the mirror was no ordinary antique. It was dangerous. "We need to get rid of it," I said. Julie nodded. "But how? You can't just throw something like that in the trash." I remembered the forum I'd read earlier. One post had mentioned cleansing rituals using salt, fire, or burying cursed objects in sacred ground, but nothing seemed certain. "We'll figure it out tomorrow," Julie said, glancing at the clock. It was nearly 3:00 a.m. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed in the living room with Julie, the two of us taking turns keeping watch. But even in the safety of the downstairs, I could feel it, the mirror's presence, like a pair of unseen eyes watching us from above. As the hours dragged on, I began to hear faint whispers. They were so quiet at first that I thought I was imagining them, but soon they grew louder, more insistent. "Let us in." The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the room with an unnatural echo. Julie heard them too. She looked at me, her face pale with fear. "We can't stay here," she said. I nodded. But as we prepared to leave, the whispers stopped, replaced by a single bone-chilling sound: laughter. It wasn't coming from the attic. It was right behind us. The laughter. It wasn't like any laughter I'd ever heard before, high-pitched, hollow, and disturbingly off-key. It echoed through the walls, a cruel, mocking sound that seemed to reverberate in the very air around us. Julie's hand gripped the baseball bat so tightly her knuckles were white. I turned slowly, heart hammering in my chest, and my breath caught. Standing in the doorway directly behind us was a figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, just my brain trying to make sense of the shadows. The stress, the fear. But then the figure stepped forward, and I could see it clearly. It was a woman, tall, gaunt, with long dark hair that hung limply around her face. Her skin was deathly pale, almost translucent, as if the blood had been drained from her body. Her eyes were black, completely void of color, like twin pools of darkness. But it was her smile that made my heart freeze. It stretched too wide, far beyond what a human face should be able to do. Her mouth was jagged, like a gash in her face, filled with rows of sharp, uneven teeth. She stepped closer, her movements unnaturally slow, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. "Do you want to play?" she asked, her voice a raspy whisper that scraped against my skin. Julie raised the bat, but the woman didn't flinch. Instead, her head tilted, almost curiously, as if she were studying us. "You can't run," she said softly. "Not from me." The temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath misting in front of me, and the shadows around the woman seemed to stretch unnaturally, reaching for us. Every instinct in my body screamed to get out, but I couldn't move. It was like the air itself had thickened, making it hard to breathe. The woman's smile widened even further, and her lips pulled back to reveal rows of teeth that were blackened and decayed. "You should have never disturbed it," she hissed, her voice suddenly louder, filling the entire room. "You should have left it alone," Julie shouted, raising the bat and swinging it at the woman. But as the bat made contact, the figure dissolved into a cloud of smoke, vanishing into thin air. The force of the swing caused Julie to stumble, and she fell to her knees, gasping for air. "Where did she go?" I whispered, my throat tight with fear. "I don't know," Julie said, her voice shaking. She looked around the room, her eyes wild. "But we need to leave, now." Before we could react, the air thickened again, and that unmistakable scratching sound started up once more. It was coming from upstairs, from the attic. "No," I breathed, my legs trembling beneath me. "Not again. I can't." But something told me we couldn't leave without confronting whatever was up there, whatever was connected to that mirror. We made our way to the stairs, the scratching growing louder with each step. Julie gripped the bat like a lifeline, and I followed her, my heart in my throat. As we reached the top of the stairs, the attic door was ajar once more. The temperature in the hallway had dropped so dramatically that I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The attic door was wide open now, as if inviting us in. The scratches had stopped, but the silence was worse, more suffocating, more oppressive. I stood frozen, my feet unwilling to move. It was like something was pulling me toward that door, urging me to step inside. Julie grabbed my arm. "Don't listen to it," she whispered urgently. "Whatever it is, it wants us to go in." But I couldn't resist. I stepped forward, drawn by an unseen force. The attic door swung open with a creak, revealing the same darkened space as before. But this time, the mirror was gone. The rocking chair remained, sitting perfectly still in the center of the room, its empty, cold eyes staring at us. I stepped into the attic, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The scratching sound had started again, but now it was coming from beneath the floor, deep within the foundation of the house. It was as if something was trying to claw its way up to us. Then, suddenly, a voice echoed in my mind. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was cold, icy, and seemed to seep into my very soul. It wasn't Julie's voice. It wasn't mine. It was the mirror, the presence behind it, the thing that had been waiting for us. I turned back to Julie, my breath catching in my throat. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, but she was frozen, unable to move. The door to the attic slammed shut behind us, trapping us inside. The scratching grew louder, frantic now, almost as if it were trying to break free. The rocking chair began to move slowly, back and forth, as though something or someone was pushing it. "Leave this place, you're mine now." The voice was louder, more insistent. It felt like it was coming from every direction, surrounding us, pressing against us. I grabbed Julie's hand, pulling her toward the stairs, but the floor beneath us began to shake. The walls creaked and groaned, as though the house itself was alive, trying to swallow us whole. "Not again," I whispered, my voice hoarse with fear. "We can't." Before I could finish, the attic light flickered one last time, then went out completely, plunging us into complete darkness. The scratching stopped. The voice ceased. The house fell eerily silent. But then, a figure emerged from the shadows, standing between us and the stairs. It was the same woman. Her black eyes locked onto mine, and her grin spread wider, impossibly wide. She opened her mouth, and I heard the sound of something wet, something heavy, dripping onto the floor behind her. The last thing I remember is her reaching out, her fingers elongated and cold as ice, before the darkness consumed us both. The air was thick with an unbearable cold. My body felt heavy, as if it were encased in ice, and every movement was a struggle. My breath was shallow, coming in short bursts, the chill in the air piercing my skin like tiny needles. I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black, suffocatingly dark, and the silence around me felt like a living thing pressing down on my chest. But then, a faint sound, a soft rustling, like clothing dragging against the floor. It was coming closer. I tried to move, to call out to Julie, but my throat was tight, as if someone had clenched their hand around my neck. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic rhythm that echoed in the emptiness. I forced my legs to move, stumbling forward, my hands outstretched in front of me, searching for anything to hold on to. The room felt impossibly large, as though I had been transported to a place beyond the confines of my house. The weight of the air around me pressed against my ears, and I could feel the presence of something far worse than the woman with the unnatural smile. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was louder now, and it wasn't just in my mind, it was all around me, its cold breath tickling the back of my neck. My body went stiff with fear, but I couldn't turn around. I couldn't move. I heard a soft scraping sound against the floor behind me. Slowly, a shadow moved into the corner of my vision. It was there again. The woman. She stood just behind me, her long black hair hanging like a curtain over her face. Her smile was wider now, more grotesque, stretching far beyond what should be humanly possible. The sound of dripping water echoed in the silence as she stepped closer, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her fingers twitched, elongated, as if they were waiting for me to make a move. I didn't know how much time had passed. Seconds? Minutes? All I knew was that every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. I was frozen in place, caught in her grip, my breath shallow and ragged. Then, as if from nowhere, I felt a hand cold, clammy, and large wrap around my wrist. It yanked me violently toward the darkness, and I screamed, but no sound escaped. My mouth moved, but it was as if the air itself had been stolen from me. The hand pulled me further into the abyss. The woman was still there, her laughter now high-pitched and maddening, bouncing off the walls of the infinite darkness. "You cannot leave," she hissed. "You're mine now." The words felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest, suffocating me. I fought to breathe, fought to scream, but it was all in vain. The hand dragged me deeper, and the darkness enveloped me, pulling me into the coldest depths of the house, as though the house itself had turned into a living nightmare. Then, suddenly, I was standing on solid ground. The cold, the darkness, the crushing silence, all of it disappeared in an instant. I found myself back in the attic, standing directly in front of the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, but this time it was different. It wasn't me. The reflection was distorted, warped, its eyes hollow, and its smile twisted in the same way the woman's had been. Its movements were slow, deliberate, and then it smiled. The mirror seemed to breathe, the glass rippling like the surface of a pool disturbed by a stone. My reflection reached out, its hand moving toward the glass. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest, but the reflection didn't stop. It pressed its hand against the glass, and I felt an unearthly chill shoot through my body. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could feel ice crawling up my limbs, freezing me in place. I was trapped. The voice no. The presence was back. "It's too late now." The reflection in the mirror began to pull away from the glass, its body stretching and distorting. I watched, horrified, as the figure in the mirror began to crawl through the surface, its limbs bending at unnatural angles as it moved toward me. I tried to move, to scream, but nothing came out. The figure grew larger, its distorted features becoming more grotesque with each passing second. It was pulling itself through the glass, its body twisting and contorting like a snake shedding its skin. I stumbled back, my legs unsteady, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure was almost out of the mirror now, its jagged, twisted grin widening as it fully emerged. It was standing before me. "You wanted to play." The voice was a low, guttural rasp, and it came from the figure's mouth. But somehow, I knew it wasn't human. I backed away, my heart racing, but there was nowhere to go. The attic was closing in, the walls narrowing, as though the house was trying to suffocate me. The mirror was gone, but the figure remained, its hollow eyes staring at me with a hunger that chilled me to the core. "You'll never leave." Suddenly, there was a loud crash from below, the sound of something shattering. Then another crash. The entire house seemed to shake. It was Julie. I don't know how I knew, but I felt her presence. Felt her fighting, struggling against the dark forces that had taken hold of the house. The attic was no longer the only place under siege. The figure in front of me grinned, its jagged teeth gleaming in the dim light. Too late. But then, from the darkness, a familiar voice called out, "Run, now." Julie's voice. It was a lifeline. With everything I had left, I turned and ran, stumbling through the attic toward the stairs. The house groaned, the floorboards trembling beneath my feet. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the footsteps behind me, the sounds of something chasing me, growing closer with each passing second. The attic door flung open, and I dashed down the stairs, my feet barely touching the ground. I could hear Julie's frantic voice calling from below, but I knew we weren't safe yet. I reached the bottom of the stairs and found her standing in the hallway, holding something, an old book, a book I hadn't seen before. The pages were yellowed with age, the cover frayed and worn. "We have to burn it," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "We have to destroy it." I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. I grabbed the book, and together we ran out the door into the freezing night. The house behind us groaned and shook as if it were alive, as if it were angry. The sound of the scratching was still there, still echoing from within the walls. We didn't look back. We didn't need to. To this day, I don't know what happened to the house or what would have happened if we hadn't destroyed the book. But I do know this: some things are better left untouched. Some mirrors should never be looked into, and some houses should be left to rot in the dark, forgotten forever. I can still remember that night like it happened just yesterday. It started with an innocuous email, just like the ones we've all received. "Hey, I've got a crazy story for you." Simple enough. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but the story that followed, it still haunts me. I can't stop thinking about it, even now. It was a cold evening, late November. The sky outside my window had already darkened, and a heavy snowstorm was beginning to blanket the world in silence. I was sitting at my desk when the email appeared on my screen. The name on the subject line caught my attention immediately. From Sarah, A Night in the Woods. I'd never met Sarah, but she mentioned something that piqued my curiosity. "You mentioned before that you were interested in creepy, real-life ghost stories. Well, I've got one for you." The email detailed an incident that happened to Sarah and her friends, who were out hiking in the woods late one fall. It sounded harmless enough, just a regular camping trip gone wrong. But as I read on, my stomach began to tighten, and a chill ran down my spine. She spoke of a cabin they'd stumbled upon, hidden deep within the forest, miles away from any road. They were lost when they found it. It was one of those old, run-down cabins you only read about in ghost stories, the kind that looks like it's been abandoned for decades. The windows were boarded up, and the wood had started to rot. But they needed shelter. It was getting late, and the cold had already started to seep into their bones, so they broke in. The door creaked open with an unsettling groan. Inside, the air was damp, and everything smelled musty. The walls were covered in mildew, the floorboards creaking underfoot, but they were grateful to be out of the cold. They set up their gear, built a fire, and huddled together to stay warm. The strange thing, Sarah said, was that there was a strange drawing on the wall, almost like a map. It was old, too old to be something someone had left recently. The lines were drawn with charcoal, and they formed a crude representation of the cabin and its surrounding area. There was something off about it, though. At the center of the drawing was a circle with strange symbols around it. Sarah felt an overwhelming unease as she stared at it. That night, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but it wasn't the wind that kept her awake. No, it was something else, something much worse. In the dead of night, she heard soft, deliberate footsteps, not from outside, but from upstairs. It was the sound of a person walking across creaky floorboards, but there was no one else in the cabin. She brushed it off as nerves at first, convincing herself it was the wind or maybe just her imagination running wild. But then it happened again and again. She tried to wake up her friends, but they were in a deep, unshakable sleep. No matter how much she shook them, they didn't stir. The footsteps continued, getting louder, coming closer. It wasn't just the sound of someone walking anymore. It was something worse, something crawling, something dragging itself along the floor. In a panic, Sarah grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made her way upstairs, her breath shallow and fast. She felt like something was watching her, and every step felt like it brought her closer to something terrible. When she reached the top, the door to the bedroom creaked open on its own. She stepped inside. There was a figure standing in the corner of the room. Its back was to her, but she could see it clearly. It was tall, too tall, and hunched over as though it had been waiting for her. The figure's limbs were long, twisted, and unnaturally thin. Its skin was pale, stretched over its bones in a way that made her feel sick. And then, the worst part, its head. It turned slowly, its neck snapping with an awful wet crack. Its eyes were black, completely black, like voids where there should be pupil sand. It opened its mouth, not to scream, not to shout. It opened its mouth to whisper. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was low, guttural, as if it came from the depths of the earth itself. Sarah froze. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't even think. Her hands were trembling, her flashlight barely illuminating the thing that stood before her, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. The figure began to move toward her, its limbs jerking at unnatural angles, like something out of a nightmare. In a blind panic, she ran down the stairs, through the living room, and out into the night. The snow was coming down harder now, the wind biting at her face, but she didn't care. She had to get away from that thing. She had to get out of the woods. But when she looked back at the cabin, it was gone. There was no cabin, no shelter, just the snow-covered forest and the sound of her own breath, ragged and terrified. And then she realized. She was standing in front of the drawing, the one from the cabin wall. It was real now. The symbols circled around her like a trap. She had no idea how long she stood there, minutes, hours, before the shadows in the trees began to stir. She wasn't alone. In the distance, she saw the figure again, slowly creeping toward her, its head tilting in that grotesque way. The shadows of the woods seemed to reach out for her, clawing at the edges of her vision. Sarah ran again, her feet slipping in the snow, but the thing was getting closer. She didn't know how long she could keep going. The woods seemed endless. Every direction she ran only led her back to that same place, the circle, the symbols, and then everything went black. I never heard from Sarah again after she sent me that email. Her last message had a single line of text. "It's coming for me again. I don't know how to stop it." I never told anyone about the story. But the woods, they always call to me now. Even in the deepest of winters, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching, waiting. Every so often, I hear whispers on the wind, and I know that Sarah's story wasn't the last of its kind. And one day, it will be mine. It's hard to explain how it feels when you realize you're not alone. Not just in the sense of having company in a room, but when the presence of something or someone lurks just beyond the edges of your awareness. Ever since I received Sarah's email, the strange occurrences started. The whispers on the wind, the dark corners of the forest that felt just a little too dark, the way the trees seemed to groan with the weight of something ancient and forgotten. At first, I chalked it up to the stress of reading that terrifying email. But as the days passed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were calling me, pulling me in, drawing me back toward that place Sarah had mentioned. A few weeks after receiving her message, I took a trip to the countryside to clear my mind. A small cabin, nestled at the edge of a dense forest, seemed like the perfect escape. It wasn't far from where Sarah had described her ordeal, though I didn't know that at the time. I just needed some peace. The first few days were quiet, peaceful even, the kind of quiet that only winter can bring. The crackling fire in the hearth, the soft fall of snow outside, the gentle silence broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin settling. It felt safe, normal. But then I saw it. On the fourth night, just before midnight, the wind began to howl through the trees. The temperature inside the cabin dropped, and I felt a strange chill seep into the walls. The fire flickered and sputtered. I figured it was just the wind, but then the whispers began. Soft at first, distant like the rustling of leaves in the wind. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But the whispers grew louder, clearer, until they filled the room, curling around me like invisible fingers. Come closer. You'll see. You'll know. My heart raced. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, the pulse of fear like an electric current in my veins. I stood up quickly, my hands shaking, and grabbed the flashlight off the table. As I turned it toward the door, I saw something I couldn't explain. A figure hunched, pale, and tall stood just outside the cabin's frosted windows, staring in. The moonlight illuminated its outline, but it was hard to make out its features. It was as if the shadows themselves had taken shape. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, staring, waiting. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away from the window. What was it? Who was it? The whispers intensified, swirling around me in a maddening chorus, pulling me toward the door. I wanted to leave, to run as fast as I could. But something about the figure, about the whispers, kept me rooted in place. I opened the door slowly, the cold air biting at my skin as I stepped outside. The figure remained motionless, but now it seemed to be beckoning me with a slow, deliberate motion of its hand. It wasn't human. There was no mistaking it. The shadows around it seemed to ripple, distorting in unnatural ways. For a moment, I thought about turning back. The rational part of me screamed to run. But then, a voice. Sarah didn't escape. The words were a whisper, but they felt like a scream in my head. And with that, everything changed. I wasn't standing outside a cabin anymore. I was somewhere else. The world around me shifted like a dream, dissolving into something far darker. The snow, the trees, the sky, all warped. The world seemed to stretch, becoming distorted, twisted. It was like I was seeing through the lens of a nightmare, where the edges blurred and reality lost its shape. I wasn't alone. In the distance, figures began to emerge from the shadows, crawling out of the trees, moving slowly but relentlessly. Their eyes, those cold, empty black eyes, locked onto me, and they began to move toward me. They were the same as the figure outside the cabin, tall, twisted, and unnatural. Their limbs jerked as they moved, like marionettes controlled by unseen hands. "You're not meant to be here," the voice echoed again, clearer this time, as if coming from all directions. It was no longer a whisper, it was a command. I tried to turn, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the ground itself had frozen me in place. I could hear them now, the creatures, the things that once were human, scratching at the edges of my mind, their whispers seeping into my thoughts. "Come closer." I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating, and cold. The snow underfoot seemed to freeze even harder. The trees bent in strange, unnatural shapes, their branches twisting toward me like clawed hands reaching out. And then, in the distance, I saw her. It was Sarah. She stood in the middle of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the things that were closing in on me. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream, but she couldn't move. She was frozen, locked in place, just as I was. She was as much a part of this nightmare as everything else. Her eyes met mine, and I heard her voice, though her lips didn't move. "It never ends. it follows you. And then, the ground began to shake. The things around me stopped moving, and the air grew heavier, darker. A massive shadow rose up from the forest floor, stretching toward the sky. The figure that had once been outside the cabin, the one that had beckoned me, was no longer standing still. It was growing, expanding, towering over everything. Its eyes were dark pits, voids that seemed to consume all light. Its grin stretched impossibly wide, and its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even human, and it was coming for me. I woke up back in the cabin, drenched in cold sweat, my heart racing. The fire had gone out, and the house was deathly silent. For a moment, I couldn't tell if I had been dreaming or if it had been real, but the fear in my chest, the tightness in my throat, told me everything. I had to leave. But when I stepped outside into the snow, the world felt wrong. The forest was still, and the trees stood unnaturally still, as though holding their breath. But deep in the distance, beyond the trees, I thought I saw something, a shadow, a figure watching from the woods. I turned, but I didn't know which direction to run. All I could do was wait for the thing to catch up with me. And somehow, I knew it was only a matter of time before it would. It never ends. The days blurred together after that. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me, even when I was back in the cabin, with its walls and doors securely locked. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, the stress, the isolation, the horror stories, but deep down, the figure, the shadow said, was all real. The cabin felt colder now. The fire couldn't seem to keep the chill at bay, and every night, the temperature dropped so low that my breath fogged in front of me. Even inside, I thought about leaving, but a part of me, something deep inside, was paralyzed by fear. What would happen if I stepped out into the snow? What would I face out there? The whispers returned too. At first, they were soft, like a breeze through the trees, but over the days, they grew more distinct, louder, urgent, like something was calling me, pulling me toward the forest once more. One night, I couldn't stand it any longer. I had to go. I had to know what was waiting out there. The clock struck midnight as I stood at the cabin door, flashlight in hand, trembling. The cold outside wrapped around me like an icy shroud, but I stepped out anyway, my feet crunching in the snow. The world was silent, save for the distant howl of the wind. The trees, once majestic and comforting, now looked twisted and bent, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I walked toward the woods, the whispers growing louder with each step. Come closer. You can't run from it. It's already inside you. I tried to block out the voices, but they were all I could hear. They seemed to come from every direction, echoing in my mind, pulling me deeper into the forest. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I couldn't stop now. I had to understand. I had to know what had happened to Sarah, what this thing in the woods wanted. And then I saw it again. The figure, the one from my dreams. It stood at the edge of the trees, its back to me, just like the first time. This time it was even taller, its limbs impossibly long, like a spider's legs. The snow around it seemed to freeze, turning the ground beneath its feet to solid ice. It turned slowly, deliberately, and when it looked at me, I could see those eyes, those black, endless voids staring into me, through me. You've seen too much. The voice was the same as before, hollow, menacing, like it came from a deep well. I couldn't move. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen in place, my feet stuck to the ice beneath me. I could feel it, the cold creeping into my bones deeper and deeper, until I thought I might shatter from the inside out. It's time to come home. The figure began to move toward me, its steps slow and methodical. Each time it took a step, the ground beneath me cracked, the ice spreading further in every direction. And then I heard something else, something that made my blood run cold. A scream, a familiar scream. It was Sarah. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in, but in the distance, I saw her. She was standing there, in the clearing, her eyes wide with fear, her mouth open in a silent scream. Her body was trembling, her clothes torn, and her face was pale, drained of all color. And then I saw it. The figure that had been chasing me wasn't alone. There were others, more of them, moving in and out of the shadows, their movements jerky, unnatural, like broken puppets. They were all closing in on Sarah, circling her, their eyes never leaving her. Sarah's scream cut through the air, but the moment the sound left her mouth, the forest seemed to consume it. The trees, the shadows, the snow, they swallowed her whole. One moment, she was there. The next, she was gone. I tried to run. I tried to scream for her, to help her, but I couldn't move. The ice around my feet had solidified, and no matter how hard I struggled, I was trapped. The figure was getting closer now, towering over me like a mountain of shadow. It stopped just a few feet away, its black eyes burning into mine. "It's your turn now." I didn't know what it wanted. I didn't know how to fight it, but I knew one thing with a terrifying certainty: it wasn't going to let me go. The figure reached out with one long, bony hand. I could feel the cold emanating from it, from the tips of its fingers, as they hovered just above my skin. The whispers were louder now, deafening, a cacophony of voices speaking over each other. "You belong to it now." And then, in a flash of cold light, the world around me shattered. The next thing I knew, I was back in the cabin, gasping for breath. My chest heaved, my hands trembling uncontrollably as I looked around the room. The fire was crackling softly, the wind howling outside, but everything was still, too still. I was alone. But then, I heard it again, a soft whisper, like a breath at my ear. "You can't escape." I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but the room was empty. There was no figure, no creatures in the shadows, just the flickering fire and the silence. But it was too late. I knew then that whatever had followed me from the woods, whatever Sarah had experienced, it wasn't over. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't something that could be escaped. I wasn't alone in the cabin. I never had been. The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, and I realized, with cold clarity, that they were waiting for me to make the next move. And it was only a matter of time before I would have to face them. The room was silent, too silent. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, but it did nothing to push back the suffocating chill in the air. I could feel the shadows pressing in on me, closing around me like a net, each one whispering my name, each one pulling me closer to something I could no longer escape. I tried to shake the feeling off, telling myself it was just fear, just paranoia, the kind that crept into your mind when you were alone in the dark. But I knew it wasn't that. The shadows were real. The whispers were real. And the things from the woods, they were still with me. The wind howled outside, but it sounded different now, more like a voice than a breeze. It echoed through the walls of the cabin, rattling the windows, as if something was trying to get in. The walls seemed to pulse, like they were breathing, alive with the presence of something that shouldn't be. The shadows in the corners grew longer, darker, like they were reaching for me. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let myself be swallowed by this madness. But the moment I thought about leaving, I felt the weight of an invisible hand press down on me. My heart pounded in my chest, my body frozen with fear, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. And then I heard it again. "You are ours now." The voice was cold, flat, and came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It echoed in my ears, in my mind, wrapping around my thoughts until they tangled and became impossible to untangle. The walls seemed to close in around me, the floorboards creaking underfoot, but there was something else, something deeper, darker. The floor itself seemed to be shifting. The cabin wasn't stable, wasn't real in the way I had once thought. I could hear the faintest sound, a soft skittering, coming from below the floor, like something crawling, scraping against the wood. I dropped to my knees, trying to ignore the way my body trembled, and pressed my ear to the floor, trying to hear what it was. It was the sound of something clawing its way up from beneath. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead as the scratching grew louder, closer. The cabin was alive, and whatever was underneath it, whatever had been waiting, was getting closer. I could feel it. I could feel it moving through the walls, up the stairs, crawling toward me with a steady, relentless pace. I couldn't move. My body wouldn't obey. The whispers in my head were drowning out everything else, every thought, every scream. The darkness pressed in from all sides. It's too late. The floor creaked again, louder this time, and with a sickening crack, a thin black tendril reached up from beneath the floorboards, curling around my ankle. My heart skipped a beat, and I gasped in shock. The tendril was cold as he coldened. It felt like it was burning through my flesh, seeping into my skin, pulling me down. I scrambled back, my pulse racing as I tried to free myself. But the tendril was too strong. It tightened, pulling me closer to the floor, dragging me toward the cold, dark space below. And then, from the depths of that blackness, I saw it. A face made of darkness. A face that was twisted, contorted into something that shouldn't exist. Its eyes were whole emptiness that sucked in everything around it. And its smile was too wide, too sharp, like a maw waiting to devour me. You should have never come here. The voice came from the face, but it wasn't a voice. It was a sensation, a feeling that cut deeper than any words ever could. It wasn't just speaking to me, it was inside me, crawling under my skin, making my bones ache with an unnatural cold. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. I reached for anything to pull myself free, but the tendril pulled harder, dragging me closer, deeper into the shadows. The floor beneath me cracked and splintered, and I was falling into the void. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. I was no longer in the cabin. I was in the woods. The snow was falling again, softly, quietly, as though nothing had happened. But it was different now. There was something wrong with the air, something thick and oppressive. The forest around me was dark, but it was alive with movement. Shadows shifted between the trees, too fast to see, too fast to follow. I could hear their whispers, feel them pressing against my skin. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, unable to break free. The world seemed to spin around me, and in the distance, I saw them. The figures. They were standing in the clearing, their backs to me, their long, twisted limbs barely visible in the snow. I knew who they were. I didn't need to see their faces. I didn't need to hear their names. I had seen them before. They were the things from the woods, the things that had taken Sarah. And now, they were coming for me. The shadows around me grew darker, stretching toward me, pulling at my legs, my arms, as though they wanted to drag me into the ground itself. The figures in the clearing turned slowly, their heads jerking unnaturally, their eyes empty voids. It's time. The voice spoke from all around me, from the trees, from the wind. I could feel it in my chest, like a pulse, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. The figures began to move toward me, their limbs jerking, their bodies stretching unnaturally as they came closer, closer. I didn't know what they wanted. I didn't know if I could fight them, but as they closed the distance between us, something inside me broke free. I screamed. I don't know how, but I did. I screamed so loud that the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath me. The figures halted, their heads tilting to the side, their eyes staring at me, unblinking. And then, for the first time since all this began, I understood. You are one of us now. The words echoed in my mind. A final warning, a sentence I couldn't escape. The figures reached out for me, their cold hands brushing against my skin. But before they could touch me, everything went dark. When I woke, I was back in the cabin. But I knew, deep down, that I was no longer the same. Something had changed. The shadows were always there, lurking just beyond the light, watching, waiting. The whispers never stopped, never let me go. And I knew, with chilling certainty, that the next time I stepped into the woods, I wouldn't be the one walking. I would be the one hunted. It's hard to describe what it feels like to live with the constant weight of fear. The kind of fear that sinks into your bones, that keeps you awake at night, staring at the shadows in the corners of your room, wondering if they're waiting for you. Since the night I was dragged into the woods, since the moment the figures touched me with their cold, bony hands, I've felt different. Not just mentally, but physically too. My body doesn't quite feel like mine anymore. The air around me is thick, like it's full of something that doesn't belong. And sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I can hear their whispers. I know it sounds insane. It has to sound insane. But I know what I've experienced. I know what's still out there. I thought leaving the cabin would help, but it didn't. It followed me. They followed me. The shadows and the figures from the woods. The things I'd once thought were a nightmare have become a part of me. They've attached themselves to me, like a curse. Every night, the whispers grow louder, as though they're speaking directly to me, coaxing me, urging me to return to the forest. I tried to ignore it, tried to move on, to leave everything behind. But every time I close my eyes, I see their faces, the faces of the things that used to be human, now nothing more than hollow shells. Their eyes black pits that seem to devour everything around them. The cold, too. It's different now. It never leaves. It's in everything: the air, my breath, the walls of my house, the trees outside. Every time I step outside, it's there. And when I sleep, when I try to close my eyes, I feel it creeping in, pressing against my chest, filling my lungs. And then there are the dreams. They're not normal dreams. They're not like the ones I used to have. These dreams feel real, too real. In them, I'm back in the woods, standing in that same dark clearing, surrounded by the figures. They never say anything. They don't need to. They don't need to speak, because I can hear them in my mind. The whispers fill me, make me understand things I shouldn't. It's time to come home. The voice is always there, always in the back of my mind. It's calling me, pulling me toward the forest, toward something that feels like an end. I don't know if they want me to die or if they want me to be something else, something new. But tonight, I can't ignore it anymore. The forest is calling me, and I can't pretend it isn't. The whispering has gotten louder, and the darkness in my house has grown deeper. It's as if it knows I'm not going to fight anymore. I can feel them around me outside, in the trees, waiting. The fire in the hearth is dying. The wind is howling again. But this time, there's something else in it. It's not just the wind, the scratching of limbs on the ground, the sound of something shifting in the shadows. I hear it every night now, just at the edge of my hearing. The creak of floorboards, the soft shuffle of feet. And when I look into the darkness, I don't feel alone anymore. I know I'm not. I step outside, my breath clouding in front of me as I make my way toward the woods. The air is so cold that it stings against my skin, but it doesn't matter anymore. I don't care. I can't care. There's no use in fighting this anymore. The trees loom in front of me, tall and twisted, their branches like reaching hands, waiting to drag me back. The snow crunches underfoot as I walk deeper into the woods, the whispers growing louder, clearer, until they're the only thing I can hear. Come. I keep walking, even though every part of me is screaming to turn back. But I can't. Not anymore. I reach the clearing where it all started. The snow is still falling, gently covering the ground, but the world is eerily silent, as though everything is holding its breath. I'm standing in the same spot I was the first time, the place where Sarah screamed, the place where everything changed. And there they are, the figures. They're waiting for me. Their limbs twist unnaturally as they move toward me, their heads jerking and snapping like broken dolls. Their eyes are empty, their faces pale and hollow, like they've never seen the light of day. They move slowly, deliberately, like they know I can't escape now. I try to turn, to run, but I can't move. My feet are frozen to the ground, and the shadows around me are closing in. They reach out, their cold hands brushing against my skin, pulling me toward them. You're one of us now. The voice is inside me, inside my mind, seeping through the cracks, filling me up. I can feel their presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. They're everywhere, and I'm nothing. I try to scream, but the sound dies in my throat. And then I hear something else, something different, a voice. It's faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. But as I listen, I realize it's not a whisper. It's a cry for help. Sarah. I turn my head, desperate to find her, but I can't see her. She's somewhere in the dark, somewhere in the woods, but I can't reach her. The figures are all around me now, their cold hands on my body, pulling me toward the earth, pulling me toward whatever lies beneath. And then I feel it. The ground beneath me shifts. It cracks open, and I'm falling. The darkness consumes me, the cold wrapping around my body as I sink deeper into the earth. The whispers are all around me now, too many voices, all speaking at once. I can't hear any one of them. They blur together. A cacophony of sound, of things that shouldn't be. And then I understand. I'm not just falling, I'm being taken. The darkness doesn't want me to escape. It never did.